letter C is another way of looking at things. Washington, Jefferson look at things in terms of judicial restraints. If you look at letter C, you see first Professor Michael John. It is now required that the meaning of the Constitution shall be in the future what it has been in the past. We are free to change the meaning, both by interpretation and by explicit amendment. So this is an example of judicial activism because Michael John, unlike Washington and Jefferson, thinks that you can change the Constitution by amendment, but you can also change it by interpretation, meaning giving new meanings to the words, even different meanings. And I'll just say, this is an unusual way of using the word interpretation. If you think of what an interpreter does, an interpreter is supposed to take the language of the speaker and faithfully communicate it in different words, in a different language, say. But that's not what these folks mean by interpretation. They don't mean help us to understand what the document means. They mean to change it, to give it a completely different meaning than the speaker intended. I don't think interpretation is the right word for that. Misinterpretation, perhaps, alteration, but interpretation is not really the right word, although that's the one that is used, I guess, to make it sound more legitimate. I'd ask you to think about when Michael John says, we are free to change the meaning by interpretation. Who's the we? It's not the American people. It is Supreme Court justices. When we change the Constitution by amendment, then it's we the people changing it. But it's by interpretation. It's just 5, 6, 7, however many Supreme Court justices, which is not the way a democratic society is supposed to work, I would add. Second bullet just gives you an example of how this subject is handled in another textbook. This textbook author says, judicial interpretation of the Constitution, especially by the Supreme Court, plays an important role in keeping the constitutional system up to date. As social and economic conditions have changed and new national demands develop, the Supreme Court has changed its interpretation of the Constitution accordingly. Because the Constitution adapts to changing times, it does not require frequent amendment. It's a completely different understanding than Washington and Jefferson. Burns, the author here, believes in judicial activism. He's teaching it as a normal part of our system, whereas it is not a normal part of our system. Our system requires that any increase of the power of the federal government will be by amendment, by the consent of the governed. But Burns wants students to think that it's completely normal for the Supreme Court to give itself more power without an amendment, to permit the federal government to go beyond its limits without an amendment, without any consideration of what it does to constitutionally limited government or self-government. And again, everybody agrees that the Constitution needs to be kept up to date, but the Constitution itself says it has to be by an amendment. Letter D focuses on a difference between the two political parties. There are a number of ways in which the parties differ. We've already studied that the Republican Party, at least by the principles it states, and conservatives believe that 1(8) should be a limit, or something resembling Article 1, Section 8 should be a limit, or there's an opposition to an expansion of the federal government, whereas Democrats or liberals are in favor of that. There's also a difference of opinion when it comes to judicial activism and judicial restraint. You can see from the words of President Bush, and this continues to the present day and has been the true for several decades. Bush says that when he appoints judges, he will appoint judges who will strictly interpret the Constitution, will not use the bench to write policy about social issues. He thinks that judges should look at the Constitution as sacred. He does not believe in liberal activist judges. He believes in strict constructionists, going by what the words mean. Whereas Al Gore says, in my view, the Constitution ought to be interpreted, that's your key word, as a document that grows with our country and our history. Gore is saying that it's fine for judges to give new and different meanings to the words of the Constitution. So there is a difference there between the two parties. Typically, the Republican Party or conservatives are for people who believe in judicial restraint, and liberals or Democrats are more in favor of judicial activism in the sense of increasing the power of the federal government and of the Supreme Court by giving new and different meanings to the words of the Constitution.